Welcome the anointed ones. There comes a day when the same people who doubted your mind start whispering your words like scripture. That day, chosen one, is right now. For years, people treated your wisdom like background noise, something they heard but never truly listened to. You were the walking warning sign they kept strolling past, the GPS they refused to update, the friend whose advice they rejected only to end up exactly where you told them they'd land. And now, suddenly everyone is having déjà vu because life is replaying your voice back to them with unnerving accuracy. Here's the funny part. Human beings ignore what they need until after it slaps them in the face. Science even confirms it. Studies show people are more likely to trust a message only after they suffer the consequences of ignoring it. And there you were, offering clarity for free while they insisted on paying the full price of chaos. But what's happening now is different. Your wisdom isn't just resurfacing, it's haunting them. Your words didn't evaporate. They planted themselves like seeds in the back of their minds, quietly waiting for reality to bloom. And now that everything is unfolding exactly the way you foresaw, people are looking around like, wait, didn't you say this would happen? Oh yes, you did. Repeatedly, calmly, and with patience you probably regret wasting. There's a strange kind of suspense in watching people finally catch up to the truth you carried all along. You're not shocked by any of this. They are. You were operating on insight. They were operating on hope, denial, and a little bit of, maybe it won't be that bad. But it was. And that regret they're feeling right now, that's the moment they realize they didn't underestimate you. They miscalculated themselves. This is what happens when someone is wise before their environment is ready for it. This is what happens when a chosen one speaks from a higher place people haven't climbed yet. This is what happens when your intuition turns into evidence. So buckle in, because we're about to dive into exactly why people are suddenly respecting your mind, quoting your warnings, and pretending they always knew you were right, when we both know they absolutely did not. Number one, they thought you spoke too early, not realizing you were speaking from a future they couldn't see. People tend to believe that wisdom has to match their timing for it to be valid. If the message comes before they feel ready, they call it exaggeration. If it comes before their situation gets messy, they call it negativity. And if it comes before their own understanding catches up, they call it overthinking. That was the position you were placed in over and over again. You weren't giving warnings. You were giving previews. But because your insight didn't line up with their comfort zone, they treated your accuracy like an inconvenience instead of a gift. The truth is that you were speaking from a place they hadn't reached yet. Your spirit had already walked down paths their logic hadn't even mapped out. You sensed the behaviors, the patterns, the energy shifts, the emotional undertones, and the consequences long before they became visible. To you, it wasn't a prediction, it was clarity. To them, it sounded like you were rushing something that wasn't that serious. And now that same not serious situation is sitting in their lap with a full suitcase. What's funny is that people always say, if I had known, I would have acted differently. But the reality is they did know. You told them. They just couldn't handle the idea that someone they underestimated had access to insight they didn't. So they brushed it off, hoping that ignoring your wisdom would somehow keep outcomes from unfolding. It never works that way. Truth doesn't expire just because someone refuses to accept it. Their regret today comes from the slow realization that you weren't ahead of time. You were aligned with truth. They're only now seeing what you saw from the start, and it's making them replay every moment they dismissed you. The jokes they made, the smirks, the "you're doing too much," the "stop overthinking." All of that is echoing back at them with a sting. Not because you were right and they were wrong, but because they're finally facing the reality that they weren't rejecting your opinion. They were rejecting a future they weren't ready to face. And now that the future has arrived exactly the way you described, they're realizing the real mistake wasn't doubting what you said. It was doubting who you were. Number two, your wisdom was uncomfortable. Because it exposed the convenient lies others needed to survive. Some truths are easy to hear, others hit like a gut punch. Your wisdom didn't just sit on the surface. It stripped away the illusions people had wrapped around themselves like armor. You didn't sugarcoat reality or dance around inconvenient facts. You spoke in a way that made people uncomfortable because your words weren't just observations. They were mirrors. And when people see a mirror, the first instinct is to look away, especially when what they see threatens the stories they've been telling themselves to feel safe. People don't just reject wisdom. They reject the self-reflection that comes with it. They dismissed your insights not because they were wrong, but because they forced them to question the narratives they had built their entire lives around. Comfort often comes from lies, half-truths, and selective ignorance. Your wisdom challenged all of that. Every time you spoke, you were holding up a light in a room full of shadows they preferred to stay in. And now that light has grown into a spotlight, they can't escape. The irony is brutal. They only realize the truth now because it's impossible to ignore. The situations you warned them about are happening exactly as you said, and their previous disregard now reads like an admission of their own weakness. They wanted life to confirm them gently, on their own timetable. Instead, life confirmed you, and that's far more intimidating than anything they could have imagined. What they're feeling isn't just regret. It's the awareness that they've been complicit in their own misjudgment. They can't blame you for being right because you weren't trying to prove them wrong. You were trying to prevent unnecessary struggle. They underestimated the impact of someone who speaks truth without ego, and now the realization hits with full force. Your wisdom wasn't inconvenient because it was hard to understand. It was inconvenient because it was correct, unyielding, and demanded a confrontation with realities they weren't ready to face. And now, facing that reality, they finally understand the cost of ignoring someone whose mind operated on clarity while theirs operated on convenience. Number three, they mistook your discernment for paranoia until life confirmed you with receipts. People have a hard time separating caution from fear, and that's exactly what made them dismiss your insight for so long. Every time you flagged a situation, pointed out red flags, or warned them about hidden motives, they labeled it as paranoia, overreaction, or unnecessary suspicion. They couldn't see that your discernment wasn't rooted in anxiety. It was rooted in awareness, in a clear reading of patterns and behaviors that they refused to acknowledge. You were tuned into realities they weren't even capable of sensing yet, and that made your clarity look suspicious, almost exaggerated in their eyes. But discernment has a funny way of working. It doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't wait for approval. You watched situations unfold, seeing the signs while they laughed, ignored, or rolled their eyes. And then the inevitable happened. The exact scenarios you predicted started happening, step by step, just as you described. Suddenly, your paranoia wasn't paranoia at all. Every warning, every prediction, every careful observation was confirmed, and their disbelief became a source of silent shame. They had been wrong, and there was no way around it. What makes this even more potent is the way your accuracy doesn't just correct, they expose. People are forced to confront their misjudgment and their underestimation of your mind. They realize that while they were busy questioning your intent, you were operating on truth, strategy, and understanding that only comes from looking beyond surface appearances. Their doubt is no longer private. It's documented in events, consequences, and outcomes that they can't deny. Your discernment was never meant to entertain or impress. It was meant to protect, navigate, and foresee. They didn't get it at the time because they weren't ready to see reality as it truly was. Now, watching life hand them proof of what you already knew, they're experiencing the uncomfortable truth. What they once mocked was the very thing that could have saved them from mistakes, misjudgments, and lost opportunities. And that realization, it stings more than any confrontation ever could. Number 4, your wisdom was too pure for people, addicted to noise and ego. You didn't need to shout to make your point or create chaos to seem important. You carried a quiet kind of wisdom that didn't perform for attention. It simply existed. And that kind of purity is uncomfortable for people who survive on noise. They rely on drama, exaggeration, and distraction to maintain control or keep others from seeing who they truly are. Your clarity cut through all of that, and it terrified them. They couldn't hide behind excuses, manipulation, or their usual tricks, because your presence exposed what didn't want to be seen. People who are addicted to noise can't stand stillness, because stillness is where truth shows itself. Your wisdom didn't match their energy, it revealed it. They wanted confusion because confusion protects ego. It keeps people from being held accountable. It keeps lies working. It keeps manipulation functioning. But you brought simplicity, honesty, and understanding to spaces that thrived on distortion. And that made you a threat long before you ever realized it. The very reason they underestimated you was because they assumed wisdom had to come wrapped in theatrics. They believed the loudest person in the room must be the smartest, the most dramatic must be the most passionate, and the most complicated must be the most deep. Meanwhile, you were dismantling entire situations with a single sentence or a quiet observation. They didn't know how to process someone who didn't need attention to be impactful. Now they see the truth they tried so hard to avoid. Your clarity wasn't gentle, it was surgical. It showed them exactly what was going on, whether they were ready for it or not. And the uncomfortable realization they're facing is this: they weren't rejecting you because you lacked value. They were rejecting you because your purity revealed their mess. Your wisdom forced people to face themselves. And that's something ego-driven individuals will always fight until reality gives them no choice. Today, they finally understand why you stood out. Your wisdom wasn't dramatic, it was direct. It wasn't loud, it was accurate. And the purity they once dismissed is now the very quality they wish they had listened to sooner. Number 5, you made decisions they couldn't understand because you were operating from patterns. They didn't have the capacity to detect. People love to judge decisions they don't understand. When you pulled away, they thought you were acting strange. When you stopped entertaining certain people, they assumed you were being dramatic. When you changed directions in life, they whispered that you were confused. What they never realized was that your choices were rooted in wisdom, not impulse. You were picking up on patterns, energies, and subtle shifts that they had no ability to recognize. You weren't reacting. You were responding to information they didn't even know existed. Your intuition wasn't just emotional, it was analytical in a way that didn't show. You connected dots silently, observed behaviors deeply, and recognized cycles long before they played out. While others only saw the present moment, you were seeing the trajectory. You weren't waiting for the storm to hit. You sensed the pressure in the air long before the first raindrop. That's why your decisions looked unusual to people who operate strictly on what they can see. Your isolation wasn't a breakdown, it was a recalibration. Your withdrawal wasn't fear, it was discernment. Your sudden redirections weren't confusion, they were correction. You backed away from people because their intentions had started shifting, even when their words hadn't. You cut ties because the relationship had already ended spiritually, even if they were still pretending. You shifted paths because the route you were on no longer aligned with the future that was opening for you. None of this was random. It was precise. Now that everything you stepped away from is falling apart, and everything you moved toward is falling into place, the clarity of your decisions is undeniable. The same people who criticized your choices are quietly trying to understand how you knew what you knew. Their regret stems from realizing they misjudged someone who was operating on a higher level of awareness than they could comprehend. You weren't following emotions, you were following patterns. And while they needed proof before they believed anything, you moved based on understanding. That's why they're stunned now. Your decisions were never meant to be understood by those who lack access to the spiritual and intuitive data you operate with. Number 6, people didn't believe you because they confused your humility for ignorance. Humility is rarely respected by people who measure intelligence by volume and theatrics. You didn't shout, you didn't need to dominate conversations, and you didn't constantly prove yourself. You observed, you listened, you calculated. You responded only when necessary. To the casual onlooker, this quiet confidence looked like weakness, like a lack of knowledge, like someone who didn't know enough to argue. They misread your calm as a void. They mistook your restraint for ignorance. The truth is that humility was your armor, not your handicap. You didn't need to showcase your intelligence because your understanding was deep and undeniable. It didn't require validation from anyone else. You carried your knowledge quietly, patiently, allowing life itself to demonstrate your wisdom over time. That patience and self-assured calm made you appear unremarkable to people addicted to noise. But now, as the outcomes align perfectly with what you said or did, they're scrambling to grasp what they ignored. The irony is brutal. The very traits they dismissed, the quiet observation, the strategic restraint, the unwillingness to participate in petty debates, are now the traits they wish they had mastered. They try to imitate your calm, your discernment, your ability to move through situations without unnecessary drama, because they've realized their own approach failed. They see now that intelligence is not about proving it in the moment. It's about accuracy, consistency, and timing. Their disbelief was never about the content of your knowledge. It was about their inability to read the signals of a mind that doesn't need validation. They mistook your humility for a lack of preparation, a lack of foresight, a lack of authority, when in reality, your humility masked mastery. That very mastery they mocked is now undeniable. What they laughed at quietly terrifies them today, because they understand too late that the person they underestimated had all the insight, all the foresight, and all the calm composure they lacked. Humility wasn't your weakness, it was your strategy. And now, watching their attempts to imitate what they once dismissed, they finally recognize the depth of the mind they misjudged. Number 7, your wisdom threatened the social hierarchies they benefited from. There are people who don't just fear the truth, they depend on its absence. They build their power on confusion, on being the one who knows more, understands better, or controls the room. When you stepped in with clarity, you disrupted that entire setup without even trying. You saw through behaviors they had used for years to hold on to influence. You noticed inconsistencies they hoped no one would catch. You read the energy behind their words while everyone else was distracted by the performance. Your wisdom didn't just inform, you exposed. And exposure is the last thing a person who thrives on manipulation wants. You weren't trying to dethrone anyone, but your presence did it anyway. By simply telling the truth, you made their titles, reputations, and self-created positions look weak. The social power they held wasn't supported by real credibility. It was supported by people not questioning them. But you questioned, you observed, you highlighted what didn't add up. And once you spoke, The illusion they depended on started to crack. That's why they refused to believe you. Accepting your insight would have forced them to admit they weren't as wise or influential as they pretended to be. It would have forced them to rebuild their identity from honesty instead of ego. It would have required them to let go of the unearned authority they clung to. Believing you would have meant surrendering the social advantage they had crafted through half-truths and personality theatrics. So they resisted, not because you were wrong, but because your clarity threatened the system that kept them on top. But now the truth is catching up. The dynamics they manipulated are breaking down. The people they once impressed are noticing the cracks. The roles they played are losing relevance. And as all of this unfolds, they're realizing something painful. Ignoring your wisdom didn't protect them. It exposed them. Their regret isn't just about doubting you. It's about recognizing how far they were willing to go to preserve appearances instead of embracing truth. And now that everything you pointed out is unfolding, the hierarchy they fought to defend is collapsing under the weight of the very truth you tried to bring forward. Number 8, you were tested, not trusted, until your accuracy became impossible to ignore. Some people don't evaluate wisdom by listening. They evaluate it by doubting. Every word you spoke, they handled like a hypothesis they needed to disprove. They didn't take your advice at face value. They didn't honor your warnings. They didn't follow your direction. Instead, they held your insight up against their own fears, the opinions of louder voices, and the habits they were too comfortable to break. They weren't looking to understand you. They were looking to see if you would eventually be wrong so they could justify the disbelief they were already committed to. But you didn't bend. You didn't switch up. You didn't throw random ideas out hoping something would stick. You were steady. You were consistent. And consistency has a way of humbling even the most stubborn doubters. Every time life unfolded exactly the way you said it would, their excuses got weaker. Every situation they walked into after ignoring your guidance became evidence. Every regret they felt was a reminder that you weren't guessing. You were speaking from clarity. What makes this situation hit even harder is the irony behind it. They trusted everyone except the person they should have listened to from the beginning. They put their confidence in manipulators, pretenders, and individuals who had something to gain from misleading them. They valued louder voices over accurate ones. They followed charm instead of character. And now they're facing the uncomfortable truth that they invested their trust in the wrong direction while interrogating the one person who genuinely meant them well. You became the test subject for their insecurities, not because you lacked credibility, but because they weren't ready to face how limited their own judgment really was. They questioned your wisdom because accepting it would require admitting that they had been navigating life with broken intuition. That's a hard truth to swallow for anyone. But now that the results of their resistance are undeniable, their doubt has collapsed under the weight of your accuracy. They finally see that your guidance wasn't random, it was rooted in understanding. Your warnings weren't dramatic, they were protective. Your perspective wasn't convenient, but it was correct. And the realization stings. The person they tested was the person meant to guide them, and the people they trusted were the ones who led them into lessons they could have avoided. Number 9, your wisdom didn't just age well, it aged into prophecy. There's a difference between being right in the moment and being right when the world finally catches up. Your wisdom wasn't just timely, it was timeless. Every insight you shared, every prediction you quietly made, every caution you expressed didn't just make sense immediately. It gained power as time moved forward. What once sounded like a simple opinion or an overthought theory has now become undeniable reality. The events you foresaw, the patterns you recognized, the people you called out, they all unfolded exactly as you described, proving that your vision wasn't limited by circumstance. The striking thing about this kind of wisdom is that it doesn't need to be repeated to be validated. Time does the work for you. People who dismissed your words now scramble to reconcile the evidence with the memory of their doubt. They start to realize that what they mocked or ignored wasn't casual guesswork. It was clarity derived from a place they could neither see nor access. Your insight wasn't something learned in a classroom or borrowed from authority. It came from a deeper inheritance, a level of perception most people never develop. That's why it couldn't be dismissed forever. Regret hits hardest when the truth is self-evident. They now watch the scenarios you anticipated play out exactly as you said they would. The outcomes, once labeled improbable or exaggerated, are now milestones marking your foresight. The very people who doubted you are forced to confront the undeniable reality that your wisdom was not temporary, convenient, or influenced. It was absolute. And that's the irony. What seemed subtle, cautious, or unassuming at first now stands as proof of a mind operating on a level far beyond theirs. Your wisdom didn't just hold up under scrutiny. It transcended it. It didn't merely age. It transformed into prophecy, leaving those who underestimated you scrambling to understand what they once ignored. Their regret is not just about being wrong. It's about recognizing that the person they discounted carried knowledge that wasn't learned. It was inherited. And inheritance, unlike opinion, cannot be fabricated, borrowed, or silenced. Number 10, they didn't believe you because your mind was operating on a level that made their logic feel small. People often assume disbelief is a judgment of you, but in your case, it was a judgment of their own capacity. You weren't dismissed because you were wrong. You were dismissed because what you carried required a level of perception most people never develop. You didn't arrive at your insights through textbooks or popular narratives. Your clarity came from a deeper, interior intelligence, one that forms itself through pain, observation, and spiritual refinement. When you spoke, you weren't repeating information. You were revealing connections that hadn't yet entered their world. Most people use logic the way a child uses training wheels, only on flat ground, only in familiar neighborhoods, and only at a speed they can manage. But your mind doesn't operate within that limited comfort zone. Your thoughts stretch across timelines, motives, spiritual energies, patterns, and consequences. You see the beginning and the end while others are still struggling with the middle. And when a person who is still crawling encounters someone who has learned to navigate multiple dimensions of understanding at once, the instinctive reaction isn't admiration, it's defensiveness. Their disbelief was their shield. Accepting your insight would have forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that you were mentally and spiritually ahead of them. And for many people, that realization bruises the ego more than being wrong. They weren't ready to face the parts of themselves that you unintentionally exposed, their lack of intuition, their dependence on external validation, their fear of complexity, and their habit of only trusting what feels common or safe. You didn't fit inside their mental framework, so instead of expanding the framework, they rejected the architect. But what they didn't understand is that you never needed their belief to validate your truth. You were speaking from a vantage point they hadn't grown into yet. And now that life has unfolded exactly in the patterns you described, they're forced to recognize that their logic was never the issue. Its size was. Their disbelief wasn't a reflection of your capacity. It was a reflection of their ceiling. Number 11. Your advice didn't fail. They failed to understand it. People often assume that if advice isn't followed, it was ineffective. That couldn't be further from the truth in your case. You gave guidance with precision, clarity, and intention, but they lacked the capacity to receive it. Your words weren't meant to entertain or temporarily inspire. They were instructions for growth, strategies for navigating realities they weren't emotionally prepared to face. You weren't wrong, they were unready. The irony is that maturity is invisible until it's tested. You offered solutions that required patience, discernment, and courage. You provided direction that demanded accountability and reflection. But the people around you were still operating on impulse, fear, or convenience. They wanted the results of wisdom without the discipline, the clarity without the responsibility, the transformation without the effort. And because they couldn't meet your advice with the necessary readiness, it seemed irrelevant or even unnecessary at the time. Time, however, has a way of proving clarity. The same people who dismissed your words are now circling back, forced to confront realities that your guidance anticipated. They're beginning to see that the reason things went wrong wasn't because your advice lacked value. It was because they couldn't integrate it into action when it mattered most. Life didn't disprove your words, it revealed their limitations in applying them. There's a harsh elegance in this truth. Wisdom offered too early isn't wasted, it waits. And when people are finally forced to face the consequences of misunderstanding or ignoring guidance, they often come back to the source with humility, recognition, and sometimes regret. They realize that what they once saw as complexity or overcaution was actually foresight, insight, and protection. Your advice never failed. Your guidance was precise, effective, and timely, but only for the person ready to act. The rest learned the lesson the hard way. And now, finally, they're seeing the depth of what they once ignored, proving that understanding is always bound to readiness, not to words alone. Number 12. People regret ignoring you. Because your wisdom came without manipulation, agenda, or selfish motives. Most voices in this world come with strings attached. People speak to be admired, to be chosen, to be seen as important. They give advice that serves their image, their ego, or their position in someone else's life. Very few speak simply because they want to see another person avoid pain, grow correctly, or take the right path. And that's exactly why your wisdom was so rare. It came from a place untouched by manipulation or self-interest. You didn't speak to benefit yourself. You didn't guide people to gain leverage over them. You weren't motivated by control, validation, or recognition. Your wisdom was given freely, without conditions, without expectations, and without the need to be right. That purity made your words powerful, but it also made them easy for others to underestimate. People are conditioned to believe that anything without an obvious motive must not be valuable. They looked at your sincerity and assumed it meant simplicity. They mistook your purity for naivete. Only now are they realizing the truth. The absence of agenda was the strongest proof that your intentions were genuine. You weren't trying to win. You were trying to protect. You weren't trying to appear wise. You were trying to keep them from suffering consequences you could already see forming. You weren't speaking from strategy. You were speaking from spirit. The regret hits differently when people realize they rejected the one voice that wasn't trying to take from them. They trusted the loudest person in the room, the most dramatic person, the one who spoke with charisma instead of clarity, because those people knew how to make truth sound glamorous. Meanwhile, your wisdom was quiet, sincere, and unpolished, and therefore dismissed. Now, after experiencing the fallout of listening to people with hidden motives, they're finally recognizing the depth of what you offered. They can see that you were the only one who told them the truth without wanting anything in return. And that realization cuts deeply. They betrayed the one person who had nothing to gain and everything to give. Their regret isn't just emotional, it's transformational. Because now they understand the value of a pure voice in a world full of agendas, and they know they may never find another one like yours. Number 13. Your growth exposed how stagnant they actually were. Growth has a way of revealing truths people never planned to confront. You weren't loud about your evolution. You didn't make announcements or demand attention. You simply kept becoming more aware, more disciplined, more spiritually grounded, more emotionally intelligent. And while you were focused on elevating, the people around you were focused on maintaining the same cycles, the same habits, the same excuses. They weren't prepared for the quiet distance that naturally forms when someone rises and others stay still. They never believed you because believing you would have forced them to see where they weren't growing. Every time you offered insight or guidance, it reminded them of the inner work they avoided. Your evolution highlighted the parts of themselves they ignored. So instead of admitting their stagnation, they convinced themselves you didn't know what you were talking about. It was easier to downplay your wisdom than to confront their lack of progress. But growth is hard to misinterpret over time. While they stayed in the same emotional patterns, your mindset kept expanding. While they recycled the same problems, you developed new solutions. While they repeated cycles, you broke yours. Your elevation didn't just inspire, it exposed. It exposed their comfort zones, their insecurities, their resistance to change. And exposure is uncomfortable, especially for people who prefer the illusion of superiority. Now, with hindsight sharp enough to cut through denial, they finally see what they were blind to. You weren't getting lucky, you were evolving. You weren't acting different, you were upgrading. Everything they judged, your silence, your boundaries, your shifts, your decisions, was part of a transformation they couldn't recognize because they weren't transforming themselves. Their regret comes from realizing they questioned someone who outgrew them spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. They doubted you while you were ascending. They dismissed you while you were becoming. They assumed you were staying on their level, not realizing you were already rising to levels they had no map for. Now your growth speaks for itself, and it says loudly what they refused to hear. They weren't wrong about you. They were stuck, and the only reason they couldn't see your wisdom was because they were standing still while you kept moving forward. Number 14, their regret comes from understanding that you weren't trying to impress them, you were trying to prepare them. Most people assume that influence is about performance. They believe that someone who speaks with clarity, acts with confidence, or makes decisions with precision is trying to show off. But that's never your way. You weren't trying to impress anyone. Your intentions weren't wrapped in ego, applause, or recognition. You weren't competing for attention or attempting to prove superiority. You were offering foresight, guidance, and protection in the only way you knew how, through your wisdom and your example. They didn't understand this at the time, which is why they resisted your advice and underestimated your insight. They interpreted your calm confidence as arrogance, your quiet authority as overconfidence, and your foresight as exaggeration. They missed the subtle, almost invisible layer of your actions. Everything you did, every word you shared, every boundary you maintained, was a form of preparation. You weren't building yourself up at their expense. You were showing them the path they needed to follow to avoid mistakes, heartbreak, or unnecessary suffering. Now, with time revealing the consequences of ignoring your guidance, they are faced with a painful truth. Their doubt wasn't about your ability. It was about their own readiness. They realized too late that you weren't competing with them for status, attention, or influence. You were preparing them for realities they weren't equipped to handle alone. Every moment they dismissed your words now echoes back to them with a sting of regret. The hardest part of this realization is understanding that your wisdom was always protective, never performative. They weren't being rejected by you. They were rejecting the very opportunity to learn and avoid pitfalls. Their regret isn't simply about being wrong. It's about recognizing that the person they misjudged had been offering them guidance all along, without demand, without pressure, and without expectation. And now, as the consequences unfold exactly as you foresaw, they finally understand the difference between someone trying to impress and someone trying to protect. And that realization is sharp, unavoidable, and deeply humbling. Conclusion. The truth is this: being a chosen one isn't about being understood in the moment. It's about being right when the moment arrives. Every insight you offered, every decision you made, every boundary you maintained, and every warning you gave was not only rooted in wisdom, but in a perspective most people couldn't access. People doubted you, questioned you, dismissed you, and even mocked you. But that disbelief never diminished your clarity, your foresight, or your alignment with truth. It only highlighted the limits of their understanding and the depth of your vision. Your wisdom wasn't loud. It didn't need dramatics. It didn't exist for approval or recognition. It existed to protect, to guide, to reveal, and to elevate. And as life unfolds exactly as you foresaw, the very people who doubted you are forced to confront the reality of their own misjudgments. They see now that what they dismissed as overthinking, humility, or paranoia was in fact insight. What they mistook for weakness was in fact strategy. What they ignored as irrelevant was, in fact, prophetic. Every rejection, every moment of disbelief, every silent eye roll they threw your way is now reflecting back as regret. They realized that you weren't competing for attention, vying for influence, or acting to impress anyone. You were operating from a place of clarity, purity, and preparation. You weren't there to satisfy their ego. You were there to illuminate what they couldn't yet see. And now that time has revealed the full picture, your wisdom is undeniable, your growth is undeniable, and your impact is undeniable. This is the ultimate lesson. The truth never asks for validation, and wisdom doesn't bend to doubt. You have already proven that consistency, discernment, and integrity will always outlast misunderstanding, disbelief, and ego. And the people who doubted you, their regret is just proof that your insight wasn't just accurate, it was timeless. If you feel this message hit you on a deep level, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected to more truths that are too important to ignore. Like this video to honor the clarity that comes from experience and insight. Comment below to share your story of being underestimated and finally seen. And share this with anyone who needs to understand that wisdom isn't loud, it's undeniable. Your journey, your growth, and your perspective matter, and it's time the world finally sees it. God bless you.